General Eaton, if you would be so kind, can you talk a little bit about, first, why we went into Afghanistan? What was our objective when we went in? And then, why are we still there?
Sure, Darcy, and thanks everybody for being here. The two broad constructs in a theoretical sense, and I've got to tell you that I just got an email that my oldest returned from Afghanistan about 3 minutes ago. So that's good news. And my youngest will get back next month. So it's not theoretical for the Eaton family, certainly not for my family. So our first involvement in Afghanistan was under the guise of counterterrorism. We went in there with a small force, technologically empowered, where you had the poster child of this thing was a special forces officer on a horse with a wooden saddle, and he's bringing in B-52 bombers with smart weapons from Barksdale, Louisiana. And we all love the image of the lone, hard charging special forces guy out there, and heavily technologically empowered by the Department of Defense. So it was a joint affair. That's what we went in there to do, was to clear out Al-Qaeda and to marshal local support to defeat the Taliban. And that has since morphed into any number of things as you wish to describe it over the years. But as we took our eye off that ball and focused on Iraq, and we turned Afghanistan into an economy of force operation while our main effort was Iraq. And at the same time, we allowed ourselves, over 2 administrations, to slide into a counterinsurgency approach to our operation in Iraq. In the run-up to the December speech that the President gave at West Point, there were 2 competing approaches on this. You had the Vice President, who wanted to remain in a CT mode, a counterterrorism mode, and you had a lot of others who wanted to push the President into a counterinsurgency approach. So the end result was, okay, we'll give this counterinsurgency approach a shot. We're going to send, and people kept using the numbers of military deployed, kept using 100,000 military deployed, when in fact the counterinsurgency approach is far less about military and far more about the rest of the executive branch and the ability of the United States to deploy expertise in a host of other arenas. So the Department of Defense saluted and executed, and we've got 98,000, 98,500 right now deployed, yet the entirety of our executive branch has been able to put 320 civilians outside of Kabul, in a country of 29 million. Now, counterinsurgency, as defined by General McChrystal and we expect by General Petraeus, is 3 military missions, 2 civilian missions. Shape, clear, hold. Those are the military components. Build and transition are the civilian components. The first 3 are going reasonably, the first 2.5 are going reasonably well. The second half of hold, Afghan National Forces, and the build and transition to Afghan governance and Afghan forces is problematic.
So, sir, if you wouldn't mind, can you explain in just a sentence or 2 what the difference is between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism for the people who don't spend all of their day working on this stuff?
Counterinsurgency is nation build heavy and protecting population to install a viable governance. Counterterrorism is a essentially military and intelligence approach to doing business, and it's to kill people who would attack the United States.
So when we went in, we were talking about doing counterterrorism against Al-Qaeda. Mr. Duss, if you would be so kind, can you talk a little bit about how many Al-Qaeda operatives are in Afghanistan according to the best estimates we have?
Right now, the estimates are between 50 and 100, Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, and then somewhere around 300 and 800 in neighboring Pakistan.
So we're spending $100 billion a year on a military presence for between 50 and 100 Al-Qaeda operatives?
That is correct.
Just checking. So clearly that seems like overkill from a counterterrorism perspective, or at least not particularly efficient use of resources. General Eaton, do we have enough resources in the country to be doing the alternative to counterterrorism, which is counterinsurgency?
When you do the military math, the counterinsurgency manual that came out of Fort Leavenworth about 3 years ago that was instrumental in driving how we went about business in Iraq, you do 1 to 40. And the math drives you past 500,000 American force equivalents. And we call an American soldier baseline 1, and you do a correlation of forces because not all soldiers are man-trained and equipped the way U.S. forces are. So it drives you to a very large number. We don't have that number of military forces. When you look at the executive branch and the way Washington operates, Afghanistan is an example of the dysfunctionality that resides in Washington, D.C. You have stovepipes of excellence in Washington, D.C., but we have a national security architecture right now that was designed in 1947 that served us well during the Cold War. But since 11/9/89, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have not adapted to the environment that we have today. So when we need Agriculture Department folks to deploy overseas to assist U.S. forces in an agriculture mission, they're not there. The Agriculture Department is not man-trained equipped to deploy resources overseas. So what we've done is develop an agri-battalion. These are uniformed military who have agricultural expertise drawn from the reserve component to do what rightfully the Department of Agriculture should do. Not because they don't want to do it. We just haven't given them the money. We haven't given them the capacity to deploy to do that.
Thank you. So, is there anyone on the panel who would disagree with the statement that it seems like we're doing neither counterterrorism, which would require a much smaller force, nor counterinsurgency, which would require much greater resources? Is that accurate?
I think we're doing a little of both, but we're doing neither as well as we would need to. I mean, just to go in the background a little, General Eaton talked about the way that resources were taken from Afghanistan toward Iraq beginning in 2002. And I think there's a general agreement among NGO experts and people who work in Afghanistan that there was a moment in there when we had an opportunity to put Afghanistan on track toward being able to kind of redevelop itself, and that moment was lost because the Bush administration decided to go into Iraq and use that as a showpiece for American power. So I think there was a tendency, President Obama, when he campaigned, he was very clear that he thought that Iraq was the wrong war, Afghanistan was the right war, and he meant it. But I think there has been kind of an overcorrection here to say, okay, if we just flood all these resources and all this money and all this manpower into Afghanistan, we can kind of set things right. And as Matt was saying, it's just really not the case. I mean, we are actually exacerbating the problem by flooding this country with all this money that just doesn't have the distributive capacity to deal with this hate money. We're increasing the corruption.
Darcy, real quick, I tend to disagree with the assertion that we took our off Afghanistan, went to Iraq. We certainly did. But I don't think if we had put more troops in Afghanistan in 04, 05, it wouldn't matter. We'd be in the position we are now, just earlier. If you look at the strategy that ISAF, the National Security Assistance Force of Afghanistan, has been conducting since 05, it's been a steady increase of troops, foreign troops, as well as Afghan army and Afghan police in the rural Pashtun, southern and eastern parts of the country. And so since 05, as we've increased the central government's presence and increased foreign troop presence, doesn't mean American troops. We put probably about 10,000, 12,000 Canadian, Dutch, and British troops in southern Afghanistan in 05 and 06, specifically to do exactly what we're talking about, to do more of a counterinsurgency approach. And actually, if you go and Google, General Barno, who was commanding general in 04 and 05 in Afghanistan, he talked about how we're doing a counterinsurgency approach then. I think we just fundamentally misunderstood the political nature of the conflict in Afghanistan. We created an Afghan government in 01, 02 that was a very centralized government that excluded large parts of the population. And we just don't understand the aspect of the Taliban gained support since 05, not because they're out there wearing sandwich boards and handing out flyers and pamphlets, but it's because as foreign troops and as Afghan troops who are not from those areas show up in valleys and villages, people go to the Taliban to get support to resist them. And so I tend to disagree with the idea that if we had done what we're doing now 6 years ago, we'd be in a better spot. I think we'd just be in the same spot now, just earlier.
Just to respond briefly, I don't disagree about the troops. I think it's more than just a question of troops. I think it has to do with attention and diplomatic resources and the level of administration and U.S. government engagement with different aid organizations. And you just saw that really drop off in 2002. So you're right, it wasn't a question of just troops. It was across the board a slow turning of attention away from Afghanistan and focusing on Iraq.